5 verses 1 through 10. Anybody remember a movie, I don't know, it's probably longer ago than I think of, called Major League? It was a baseball movie, and it was where, I think if I remember right, it was where a Major League Baseball team went on strike, and so they had to bring in replacements. And all the chaos and all the confusion and all the shenanigans that went on with that in order to keep the ball team going during that season. There was another movie called, I think, The Replacements, where it was a football movie along the same line, where they brought in all these players in, and they had to readapt and they had to readjust. And in both cases, in the end of it all worked out really good. And then there was a real life story of the Women's League Baseball, that whenever, I think it was World War II, that whenever Major League Baseball didn't have the players, they brought in women and started a Women's League Baseball in order to try and keep the momentum for the Major League going. And if you've ever watched that movie, you know that of some of the struggles that they went through. That was real life. That wasn't just Hollywood. Point I want to get at is we're all replaceable. And that is not a discouragement in any way, shape, or form. I think one thing that Paul knew, as well as anything else, was that he was replaceable. And so his focus could be on doing all he could, but also realizing it wasn't all up to him. To be replaceable, it kind of changes, it can change our whole outlook and can be an inspiration instead of a negative thing. There was a deal that come on Facebook. I've seen it several times over the years, and it says by the time before you're even cold in the grave, your position in life has already been replaced, and somebody else is filling your shoes. Now, the attitude that can go with that is then why even try? And that's completely wrong attitude. And I want to look at it from Paul's point of view today out of 2 Corinthians. I'm just going to read the first 10 verses. For we know that if the earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For indeed in this house we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven, inasmuch as we, having put it on, shall not be found naked. For indeed, while we were in this tent, we groan, being burdened, because we did not want to be unclothed, but to be clothed in order that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Now he who prepared us for this very purpose is God, who gave to us the Spirit as a pledge. Therefore, being always of good courage, and knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. For if we walk by faith, not by sight, we are of good courage, I say, and prefer rather to be absent from the body and to be at home with the Lord. Therefore, also, we have as our ambition, whether at home or absent, to be pleasing to him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body, according to what he has done, whether good or bad. Paul, as you know, was the man who was entrusted with the gospel, who went out to the Gentiles after he had tried to destroy the church. I mean, he did everything he could to completely destroy it, to lock up anybody who, by any means, he felt necessary to stop that movement. But after the Lord got a hold of him, he started the exact opposite, preaching the gospel, going from place to place, establishing churches. And as he established a church in a vicinity, and we've been studying about this in Bible study here lately. After he had established a church in a locality, then he would stay there for a period of time and develop the leaders, and then he would leave and go to the next place as the Lord led him. And how hard it would be to have started this church and started this foundation, laid the foundation, and then walk away from it and trust and hope and pray that it still keeps going on in the right direction and in growing and in building and developing what God had in mind for it. Now, there were some of the churches that did just exactly that. And there were some that strayed. And we can be glad that they did stray. I mean, honestly, whenever you look at it from our point of view. Because if they had never strayed, then all that Paul would have ever written as far as letters is keep up the good work. Can you imagine our New Testament with just the 4 Gospels and 14 letters or however many letters saying, keep up the good work? But instead, he was able to write to them and says, well, I understand that this has kind of been a problem in your situation, and this is how I think that you need to address it. This is how I think you need to take care of this. And his heart was always with those people, but his body could not always be present with them. But he knew throughout his history, throughout his ministry, that it was not all up to him to make sure that it worked. And so it wasn't that he was carrying such a heavy burden that he was unable to move or unable to do anything, but he was encouraged that even if God took him out of the picture, God was still on his throne, and God would bring up somebody else to fill it in and see to its completion. So the attitude that Paul had was, since I know that it's not all up to me, I have the opportunity to do all I can while I'm here. When you read in the book of Philippians where he's been in prison for a long time, and he writes to the church in Philippi, and he says, if it was up to me, I'd just soon go on and be with the Lord. Yeah, I would just love to do that. But until that time, I'm going to keep doing all that I can do to keep promoting the gospel message of Jesus Christ. Earlier in the book of Corinthians, he talks in the first letter, he hears of a division within the church, and he addresses it. And he says, well, I understand that some of the church is saying, well, I am of Apollos, and others, I am from Paul, and others, well, I am from Peter, and others, I just follow Christ. The only problem was they were all going in different directions. And his recommendation was to reunite because, remember, we're all working together. He could have very easily had said, I started this church, come back to me. Come back to my teachings, just come back to my followings, and just do what I told you to do. But knowing that he could not be there in person and that he might not ever get back there in person, he says, get back to the basics. Get back to the following of Christ. Get back to the unity of the Spirit. Because I may not be with you ever again. I may not be with you much longer. All throughout the Bible, we read where people have been replaced. Moses, the great savior of the Israelite nation, who led them out of Egypt, led them through the Red Sea on dry ground, led them for 40 years in the wilderness, brought them right up to the place where they was getting ready to go into the promised land, and God says, okay, it's time for Joshua to take over. And Joshua led them in to conquer the land. He was replaced. Elisha was a prophet of God who became a great prophet of God, and he replaced Elijah. You know the story where Elijah and Elisha was together, and everybody, for somehow, some way, some reason, they knew that Elijah was going to disappear that day. They just didn't know how and when. And Elisha wouldn't leave his side. And Elisha says, he says, I'm going to stay right here with you. And Elijah says, I don't know how this is going to happen, so you better stay back. And he said, no, he says, I want to stay right here with you. He says, what is it that you want? And he says, I want a double portion of your spirit. And the chariot of fire came and took Elijah away. And Elisha, if you go and start counting all of the miracles that Elisha did and compared to all of the miracles that are recorded that Elijah did, Elisha performed twice as many miracles. The last one being whenever they threw somebody's bones or somebody's dead body onto Elisha's bones because they was in a hurry because a war was brewing. And whenever that dead body landed on Elisha's bones, he come back to life. That was the final miracle that he performed. And so after he had performed that, after all these things, all the way through the Bible, somebody's replaced by somebody else. David replaced Saul as king of Israel. Solomon replaced David. So on down the line, all the way through. The idea that it's all up to us and that nobody can do what we have to do puts a burden upon each one of us that is unbearable and is unrealistic. But Paul looked at it from a whole different point of view. He says, I know that my time here on this world is short. And because it's short, I want to leave this place better than what I found it. I want to be able to share the gospel with as many people as what I possibly can. Now, granted that none of us are Paul. None of us have the ability maybe that Paul had. None of us may have the calling that Paul had. But we can all leave this world in a better place than the way we found it because we have the opportunity to share Christ with our kids, with their spouses, with their friends, with their family. And we're not going to reach them all. But that doesn't mean that we should just throw up our hands and say, forget it. But yet, we kind of do that. And sometimes we think that if God calls us to do something, that we worry about the results so much more than just doing the job. And we worry about so many things that we cannot control. This morning I was sitting here praying, and I was praying about a situation, and I said, Lord, just give me the wisdom to get through it. I don't want to have to worry about all the what ifs, like I can do anything about it, because I can't. But I know you can. So just lead me into what you want me to do. And that's what Paul was doing. He says, I know where I'm going to be when this heart quits beating. I know where I'm going to be when I take my last breath. And so because of that, I can really live right now. And I believe with all my heart that until you have your reservations made in heaven, you don't know what life is yet. Whenever you can rest assured that Christ has died for your sins, that he is God's son, and that you have trusted him with your heart, and you're trying to follow after him, and you know beyond a shadow of a doubt, because of your faith, not because of anything you've seen, but because of your faith and because of the hope that is in him, that whenever this life is over, that new life begins. That song that we sang at the chorus, "And time shall be no more," I always sang that wrong. Because I always looked at that as whoever the author was that wrote that, and the implication that whenever this life is over and time shall be no more, I always read that as we run out of time. Life is over. It's just time has run out. The sand has run through the hourglass, and it's all over with. And I realized that as I saw that up there today, that time shall be no more, because whenever we get to heaven, there is no time. There's no mornings and there's no evenings. There's no daytimes. There's no sunsets. There's no darkness. There's no time. Eternity does not have a clock. Imagine what your world and my world would be like if we had no clocks. I mean, just for a moment, if you didn't have a deadline that you had to get something done every day, that you didn't have to be at a certain place at a certain time every day. Imagine how we would look at things. Now, you know, and I used to hear that retired people, you know, don't have clocks. That ain't true. Seems like we've got more to do after you start trying to slow down than what you ever had whenever you was working on full time. But time will be no more, because once we get to that point, we don't have to worry about it. Do what we can do while we're here. In that last verse that I read, it says, and we all will stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Do a little research on that. Imagine what it's like to stand before the judgment seat of Christ, because you're getting replaced. Standing there, is God going to say, you know, on this side I'm going to put all the good things that you've done. On this side I'm going to put all the bad things that you've done. And whichever one has the most is whether you get in or whether you don't. Do you think that's how God's going to do it? He's not. Because that would be salvation by works, and that's not part of it. The thief on the cross, look at him. Remember, he was hanging on the cross, and the other guy was making fun of him and saying, you know, if you're who you say you are, come down off that cross, save us and save yourselves. Save us, not because we've done anything, but save us and save yourselves. And the other one says, why don't you shut up, because we deserve to be here, but he doesn't. And he just turns to Jesus with his head and he says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. That's all he said. And everybody knows what Jesus replied back. This day, you're going to be with me in paradise. Now, if he stood before the judgment seat of Christ, did God say, you know, you were a murderer, you were a thief, you did this, you did this, you did this, you did this, you did this? He would not be in paradise. He would never get in. Because he just had moments, maybe a couple hours at the most, of turning to God. So when we stand before the judgment seat of Christ, he's not got the scale out there saying, you know, this could go either way. But what if, when we stand before the judgment seat of Christ, God says, what have you done to prepare for this moment? How have you prepared for being right where you're at right now? Changes perspective. We're not talking about all the good things you've done, all the bad things you've done. How have you prepared for this moment? Have you lived your life as though you're going to live forever, and so you never worried about eternity? You know, there are some people who fear dying, and I can understand that. You know, we've never done it before. And there are some people who think that they're going to live forever until that moment where they don't. Some people think that, you know, a decision I made whenever I was a little kid is going to get me into heaven. I haven't done anything since then, but I made that decision back then, so that's going to get me in. How much preparation did they make for that moment? Think about it. What about the person who struggles, who accepted Christ, trying to live for him, but they're just as human as you and I, and they fall down and they get back up, brush themselves off, ask for forgiveness, go a little bit further, fall down again, ask for forgiveness, brush themselves off, keep going, and their life is just a pattern of falling down and getting back up. But each time, they know enough to at least admit that they did wrong. And so they repent of that, and they keep moving forward. What have you done to prepare for this moment? I realized that every time I messed up, that I'd messed up. Sometimes it took me a while, but I realized that sometimes, at some point, I realized the error of my ways. And I've tried to turn from that. Unfortunately, I've made that same mistake more than once, but I keep trying to do better each time. And I can't help but think that God's going to look at that and say, you know, your heart was turned towards me. Your life is imperfect, but your heart and your ambition was turned towards me. Come in, thou good and faithful servant. Just because you made some mistakes, don't make the difference. And some people just want to think, you know, when this life is over with, it's all over with. Some people never want to die. You know, I can kind of understand that. But look at it this way. Who wants to take an aging body that is getting weaker, spending more time in the doctor's office than you are anyplace else, into eternity? You know, I'm praying for a whole lot better glorified body. And I don't doctor much. But I don't like the idea that God's going to take this decrepit body and send it to eternity just to get older and more decrepit. So I believe that God is going to give us that new glorified body, but he's going to do it not based on how good of a job we did here, but how a sincere faith that we had. By realizing that we are replaceable, makes us realize that, first of all, that we have an expiration date. It also makes us realize that it's not all up to us. It's not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to do what God calls us to do to the best of our ability, to invest ourselves in that calling, and then let God take care of the results. You know, Paul never saved a person in all of his ministry. He started how many churches? He baptized so many people. He shared Christ with so many people. The guards that were chained to him while he was imprisoned, he shared the gospel with them, and it sounds like he did a great job of converting many of them, because the prison guards were all his supporters because of what he had shared with them. But you know, he never saved a one of them. He led them to salvation, but it was Christ who saved them. Our job as replaceable people is to do what we can while we have the opportunity. Let God take care of the rest of it. Let God take care of the outcome. It frees us up because all of a sudden we're not worried. We don't have to worry about the what ifs. Well, I would invite somebody to church, but what if they say no? I would share Christ with them, but what if they make fun of me? Well, what if they do? It doesn't really make that much difference. But to live in such a way that we're prepared for that whenever that last breath is taken here, and our first day, one day, begins in eternity. And we stand before the throne of God and the throne of Christ at the judgment seat, and he says, I'm not worried about all the things that you did wrong. I'm not even worried about all the things that you did right. We're not going to concern. But you have prepared yourself for this moment. Because every time you fell down, you got back up and you came back to me. That's the key. You have made your life in preparation, even with all of its faults, even with all of its failures, even with all of its successes. You have been directing it towards spending eternity with me. We're all replaceable. And that is a freedom, not a burden. That is a freedom. And that's, I believe, the way Paul lived. And I believe that's why he was so effective, because he could share the good news of Christ, not worried about what was going to happen. Whenever you look at some of the things that Paul went through sharing the gospel, he was beat with a cat of nine tails, I don't know how many times. I think it's in Galatians, I believe it is. He was beaten with rods. He was shipwrecked. He was sick. He had everything in the world happen to him. Anybody in their right mind would say, I've had enough of this. I'm not going to do this anymore. That Paul says, this is a small price I'm going to pay, because one of these days I'm never going to have another sickness. I'm never going to have another suffering. I'm never going to have another hurt. I'm never going to have another ache and pain. I'm never even going to have a bruise on me, because I'm going to have a glorified body. I'm going to be with the Lord forever and ever and ever. And all these troubles of this world are going to pass away, and I'm going to be with him forever. And because of that, that day is coming, and I don't know when they are, and doesn't really matter. He was fine if it was today or yesterday even. As long as that day's coming, and I know that it is, then I can live in freedom. I can live in a freedom that I can work for him and appreciation for all that he has done for me, but also all that he is going to do for me. And the neat part of it is, he's doing it for every one of us. We read the Great Commission, and Jesus shared the Great Commission with his 11 disciples that were left. If that Great Commission only applied to them, the gospel would have died 2,000 years ago. But it applies to every one of us. Doesn't mean we all got to be preachers, thank God. But it just means that we should live with the expectation that one of these days, all my troubles are going to be over. One of these days, all my aches and pains are going to be gone. One of these days, I'm not going to know what sorrow is. It's going to be a distant memory. That's all it's going to be, a distant memory. One of these days, I'm going to live in peace and joy and happiness. And because of that, I have the opportunity to share that with somebody else. Because of that, I can do the work that he's called me to do, whatever it is. Because of that, as the song says, I can face tomorrow. Can you face tomorrow? If Christ were to ask you today, what are you doing to prepare for eternity? What would your answer be? Based on something you did many years ago? Based on the attitude you've got today? I can't answer that question for anybody but me. But it's making me challenge myself to daily live for that day and to be inspired for that day. The day that, praise God, I'm replaced because I've went on to bigger and better things. This morning, if you are here and you've never accepted Jesus